Hello, friends. Today, we're going to draw a cat who decided to steal a dumpling. If you're just starting out or aren't very confident in your skills, or if you've taken a long break, start with a small sketch. Don't set yourself big, ambitious goals. Don't go for a large sheet of paper right away. This kind of drawing is better done on cotton paper as it involves many important techniques. However, if you're doing a small sketch, cellulose paper will do just fine. Right now, I'm drawing on Bahong cellulose paper. Start by marking the main elements on the sheet to ensure everything fits in place. About 2/3 of the space will be occupied by the table. My sheet is slightly wider than a standard A4, just a bit wider. The composition follows the classic rule of thirds. 2/3 of the space is taken up by the table, and the remaining third is divided between the cat and the background. I'm marking the cat with a kind of block to make sure it's the right size, nice and chunky. We have the board slightly angled towards us, coming into the foreground. Let's mark the cat's paw with a large oval shape. Observe the shape of the nose and the distance from the nose to the lips. Double check to ensure the ears aren't placed too high. If needed, lower them slightly. Sometimes, as you start adding more detailed elements, you'll realize that adjustments are necessary. I noticed that the ears seemed a bit too high, so I'll lower them. Also, it might have been better to start with the eyes a bit earlier, as this would have helped align everything better. Constantly compare the distances and proportions of your elements with the reference image. Every time you draw a new feature, whether it's the width of the cheeks or the height of the nose, refer back to the reference to ensure accuracy. Next, check the positioning of the paws. The paw that's extended forward should be straight, while the one to the side should be slightly angled. Pay attention to how far the side paw is positioned relative to the body. Now let's add the dumplings. They have a unique shape, each one a bit different from the others. Some show more of the filling, while others show less. After drawing the cat, drawing the dumplings should be relatively easy. Just replicate the shapes, a circle with a little edge around it. If you're just starting out, draw only one dumpling as a warm-up. This will help you practice smooth colour transitions and gradient effects. Once the drawing is complete, we'll work with masking fluid. If you don't have masking fluid, you can use white paint or a white gel pen later. Before using the masking fluid, shake it well, as it can separate. Always use a brush you don't mind ruining, because the masking fluid tends to stick to the bristles. I used an old, slightly trimmed synthetic brush. A good trick is to wet the brush a little before working with the masking fluid. It will stick less this way. And always rinse the brush immediately after using it to prevent the fluid from hardening on it. The stripes on the cat's fur are slightly curved, growing from the base of the ears, where you'll also find small hairs. These are the cat's equivalent of eyebrows. The same applies to the whiskers, which are also thin and slightly curved. Make sure these lines are thin and delicate, though you can adjust the colour later. Aim to make these lines as fine as possible. Ensure that the whiskers don't stick out rigidly like wire, but rather bend naturally in the direction they should, giving the fur a soft flowing appearance. Now we're going to work wet on wet. Before starting, prepare your colours in advance. Choose the ones you'll be using. For this, ochre paints will be useful, along with any brown shades you have, like burnt sienna or natural sienna. I also use a bit of English red and black. I'm using this calligraphy brush, which is convenient because you can flatten it with your fingers, turning it into a sort of fan brush. It holds water well, but you can also use it for dry brushing. I have several of these brushes in different sizes. Choose the one that feels most comfortable for you. Now, I'll be filling in everything except where the cat and the table are. We'll work on those areas later. I'm covering everything else. If you're being super meticulous and working on high-quality cotton paper that holds water well, you generally fill the entire area first. For beginners, I recommend working in stages like this. I start by working on small sections. Be sure to prepare your colours in advance so you don't waste time and risk the paper drying out while you choose colours. The main tones here are all shades of brown, with some yellowish and reddish tints. Although I generally don't like using black, I'll be using it here. Black can overpower and dull other colours, so I want the cat to have more yellowish and ochre tones. The paper I'm using is cellulose-based, which is porous. It's not as absorbent as cotton paper, but the paint still spreads nicely. You can tilt your sheet or prop something under it to help with the flow. Make sure the paper is secured, either with painter's tape or on a block, so it doesn't warp or buckle. The background is filled in very chaotically. There's no deep detailing here, just a mix of browns with a bit of black mixed in. The paper is cellulose-based, and although it's not as comfortable to work with as cotton, it still spreads the paint in pleasant patterns. I start with light colours, so I begin with ochre. I'm now filling in the areas that need to remain open. You can see how much the colour spreads, especially in these conditions where the humidity is quite high. The paper is absorbing a lot of moisture, so I recommend trying a small sketch before committing to a larger piece. Make a small swatch to see how the paint spreads on the paper you're working with, because sometimes a small drop can spread a lot, and you may end up with the colour running everywhere. On this paper, the colour spreads quite heavily and sinks deep into the fibres. I'm gradually adding a bit of English red on the sides to brighten the piece. Looking back, I think I could have used even more vibrant colours and less dark shades, but here we are. Now, I'm working with a mix of burnt sienna and black, gas black. While the paint is still wet, I carefully add some stripes with the brush's tip in the areas that will need more detail. If the paint starts to spread too much, you can blot your brush on a napkin and lightly wipe the area to control it. Working wet on wet requires a bit of intuition, as you have to stay in touch with how the paint is behaving on the paper. Keep an eye on how it flows. If you're too focused on copying my exact steps, your paint will likely behave differently, because even for me it never flows the same way twice. The key is to work from light to dark, gradually building up the tones while the paint is still wet. As soon as you notice the paint starting to dry and form layers, it's time to stop and let it dry completely before continuing. As we build up the darker tones, I use less and less paint. Initially, my brushstrokes were heavy with colour, but now I'm using a smaller brush and applying more concentrated paint with less water. As the paper starts to dry, I use the brush's tip to carefully deepen the colour where needed, particularly on the side of the cat. I'm waiting for it to dry gradually. Your paper is very smooth, the masking fluid will come off easily. If it's rougher, you might need to work a bit harder. After removing the masking fluid, you'll see that the lines left behind are quite stark. We don't need such harsh white lines, so we'll tone them down by painting over them lightly with colour. Add some light shading to the whiskers and around the cheeks. Even a little bit of grey will make them look more natural, while still keeping them lighter than the base colour beneath. Do the same for the hairs around the ears and whiskers. Gently tone them down with a thin brush. You'll want to soften these lines so they blend more naturally into the rest of the drawing. Next, we'll work a bit more on the shadows when we tackle the board. But for now you can add a bit of shadow under the paws to give them more depth. Although the paws are white, adding a touch of brownish grey in the shadow areas will make them look more three-dimensional and realistic. Now that we've finished with the cat, we've separated the face from the paws using darker shadows. We've also added more detail to the face and shaded the paws. At this point you can relax a bit and start working on the dumplings. They are much simpler. After drawing the cat, this part will be more enjoyable. The dumplings don't need to be as precise, just have fun with them. Grab a larger brush and wet the area where you'll be adding colour. You can start working with the same colours you used on the cat, but make them softer and lighter for the dumplings. I've just squeezed out a bit more ochre to continue filling in the colours. The colours are similar to those used for the cat, but softer and more muted. Now we'll be working with more transparent colours. If something spreads or flows in an unexpected direction, you can simply add a splash of water to create spots that will look like flour or dough. Have fun with this part. It's not critical exactly what colours you use. The cutting board is warmer and more brownish, while the table is darker and greyer. When working on the rolling pin, use horizontal strokes and tilt your brush slightly to create a scraped effect. Start with a warm brown, add a bit of yellowish tone at the bottom, and leave the top lighter. You can also add some drops of water to create subtle effects. Outline the handle with a darker line and add shadow underneath the rolling pin for depth. On this paper, colours tend to blend together, so after the first layer dries, you might need to add another layer to intensify the contrast. For the dumplings, which aren't pure white, use a light brown or greyish tone. Start with a warmer shade for the folds and shadows. Work on one dumpling while waiting for the background to dry on another. The lightest part of the dumpling is almost white, but even here, add a hint of colour and then blot it to keep it light. Remember to add shadows beneath the dumplings. The shadow should be a soft, diffused line that you can gently blend out with your brush. As the colours dry, you may want to add more shadows to make the dumplings stand out more. The better you define the shadows, the more the dumplings will seem to lift off the page. If the colours look a bit faded, go over them again to make the contrast between the board and the table more distinct. You may not need this extra layer if your colours are already vibrant enough. Go with what feels right to you. I'm adding a little more colour to the board's handle. Some of the paint spread too far, but it's not too noticeable. Even if some areas didn't turn out perfectly, they don't stand out much. I added some more colourful spots and smudges to the board to give it a more dynamic background. And that's pretty much it. You can now step back, sign your work and decide if there's anything else you want to add or adjust. This was a really enjoyable and interesting project. Keep practicing, even if it's just small sketches. Each one will turn out cute and charming. See you in the next tutorial. Bye!